Sexuality is older than religion. It's older than law, older than culture. Long before temples, commandments, or priests, human beings felt desire. We sought intimacy, formed bonds, and created families. Nobody had to teach us. Nobody had to write it down. Desire was as natural as breathing. But somewhere along the way, something happened. What was once ordinary and human was rebranded as dangerous. Entire civilizations began to whisper that pleasure was unclean, that your body was a threat, that even your private thoughts could condemn you. Why? Because if you can take something universal, something no one can escape, and attach guilt to it, you gain a kind of power no army can match. A power that follows people into their bedrooms, their marriages, even their own minds. This is not about morality, it's about control. And the most effective form of control is the kind you don't have to enforce with chains or prisons. It's the kind that makes people police themselves, even when they're alone. So the question isn't why religion taught us to be ashamed of sex. The real question is, what did it gain by doing so? The birth of sexual rules. In the earliest agricultural societies, long before most of the holy books we know today were written, rules about sex began to appear. But they weren't originally about virtue, or purity, or even morality. They were about property. When people started farming, land suddenly mattered. Wealth could be passed down, controlled, fought over. And if you could dictate who slept with whom, you could decide which families inherited power, which bloodlines rose, and which ones were erased. Marriage laws weren't sacred, they were economic contracts. Reproduction wasn't holy, it was bookkeeping. Control over sexuality meant control over resources. And once that link was discovered, it was too valuable to ever let go. But here's the twist. Practical rules don't inspire obedience for generations. People question them, people break them. So these laws needed something stronger than politics. They needed a disguise. And that's when sex began its transformation. From a matter of family order to a matter of the soul. Desire wasn't just risky anymore, it was dangerous. A choice about who you touched could now echo into eternity. A private act could condemn you forever. What was once a question of inheritance became a question of salvation. This shift changed everything. Suddenly, sex wasn't just between people. It was between you and a divine authority, watching from above. And unlike a village elder or a king, a god doesn't sleep. A god doesn't forget. This is the moment where sex stopped being natural and started being weaponized. Because once guilt is tied to your biology, it becomes inescapable. You can choose what to eat, what to wear, what to say, but you cannot choose whether or not you feel desire. That's why sexual rules became the perfect tool for power. They weren't just about stopping unwanted pregnancies. They weren't just about keeping families in line. They were about creating a system where obedience was measured not by your actions, but by your thoughts. And once obedience becomes invisible, once it takes place in your own mind, you no longer need guards or soldiers. You carry the prison with you. So the question is, not just why were these rules written, it's why were they rewritten as sacred? From practical law to eternal sin. At first, sexual rules were about keeping order. Who married whom, who inherited land, who carried on the family name. But order only lasts as long as people agree to it. And people don't always agree. That's where religion stepped in. What had once been practical law began to wear a spiritual mask. Rules about marriage and reproduction were no longer just contracts. They were suddenly decrees from heaven. To break them wasn't just disobedience, it was sin. This was a brilliant move of control, because if a rule is only political, it can be argued with, changed, ignored. But if a rule is sacred, it carries eternal weight. You don't just risk punishment in this life, you risk your soul in the next. Desire became rebranded as dangerous. Pleasure outside the sanctioned box wasn't simply frowned upon, it was condemned as corruption. And this wasn't limited to actions. Even your thoughts could betray you. A passing attraction, a private fantasy, a dream you didn't even choose, these became evidence of spiritual failure. That's the genius of transforming law into sin. You can avoid stealing, you can avoid murder, but you cannot avoid desire, which means you cannot avoid guilt. And once guilt is inevitable, forgiveness becomes a permanent need. That's the loop. Create a sin no one can escape, then present yourself as the only cure. a system where you define the problem and sell the solution endlessly. But this transformation had a darker edge. It divided humanity against itself. Men's behavior was often excused, reframed as weakness or impulse. Women's behavior, however, became a matter of purity, their worth tied entirely to sexual history. This double standard wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. By controlling women's sexuality, institutions could control marriages, family alliances, and the stability of entire communities. And yet, the deeper tragedy is this. What once began as bookkeeping over land and property had become something much more invasive. It wasn't just about who inherited fields anymore. It was about who inherited shame. Once desire became sin, it stopped being just a private act. It became a lifelong sentence written into the body itself. Which leads to the next question. If guilt is permanent, what kind of control does that create over a person's mind? Guilt that never ends. Guilt is powerful because it doesn't need walls or chains. It doesn't need guards standing over you. Once planted, it grows by itself. And sexual guilt, unlike almost any other kind, cannot be escaped. Think about it. You can avoid stealing. You can avoid lying. You can even avoid violence. But you cannot avoid desire. Attraction will appear without permission. Thoughts will surface without warning. Dreams will come without your consent. And here's the trap. When the standard is perfection, guilt becomes guaranteed. Everyone fails. Everyone falls short, which means everyone is guilty all the time. This is where the system shows its brilliance. Because if guilt is permanent, forgiveness also becomes permanent. You don't just need it once. You need it over and over, endlessly. And who controls forgiveness? The same institution that defined the sin in the first place. It's the perfect cycle. They define what's impure. You inevitably fail. They offer the cure. And you return again, trapped in the loop. This is not morality, it's maintenance. A self-replicating system where your shame keeps the structure alive. And the cost isn't just ritual or money. The cost is psychological. To live under permanent guilt is to live under constant surveillance, even if no one else is watching. Because you've been taught that a god is. Desire becomes a crime scene. Your own mind becomes hostile territory. This is why sexual guilt is so efficient as a tool of control. Armies cost money, prisons require guards. But once the voice of guilt is inside you, the work is done. You carry the authority in your own head, whispering that you are never clean enough. And the worst part? That voice doesn't fade when belief fades. Even people who walk away from religion often carry the guilt with them, years later, long after they've stopped believing the doctrine that created it. Because once guilt is welded to something as basic as your biology, it doesn't feel like doctrine anymore. It feels like you. Which leads us to the next step. If guilt controls the mind so completely, what happens when even thoughts become sins? Policing thoughts, not just actions. At first, rules were about behavior. Don't steal. Don't kill. Don't sleep with someone else's spouse. Actions you could see, track, punish. But religion didn't stop there. It moved into territory no law had ever reached before, the human mind. It wasn't enough to regulate what you did. Now, even what you imagined could condemn you. A passing glance, a private fantasy, a dream you couldn't control. Suddenly, your own thoughts became moral failures. This was revolutionary as a method of control. Because, how do you avoid thoughts? You can lock your doors to avoid crime. You can walk away to avoid conflict. But you cannot walk away from your own mind. The more you try not to think something, the more it forces its way in. That's how thought suppression works. Psychology proves it. Tell someone not to think of a pink elephant, and the image appears instantly. Religion exploited this paradox perfectly. By declaring that lustful thoughts were sins, it created a battlefield no one could ever win. You fight against yourself, lose, and feel guilty, again and again. And guilt, that deep, doesn't just stay inside. It makes you suspicious of others too. If you fear your own mind, you also begin to fear theirs. Parents shame their children for questions. Communities gossip, punish, ostracize. The fear spreads outward, turning private struggle into public policing. The result is a population that surveils itself and each other without anyone in power lifting a finger. No armies required, no prisons needed. Every believer becomes both prisoner and guard. And there's another consequence. When you're constantly reminded of your own failings, you're less likely to challenge the failings of those above you. If you're always guilty, always unclean, who are you to question authority? The leaders stay untouchable, while the people stay trapped in self-doubt. That is the genius of moving control from actions to thoughts. It expands authority into the one place no one should ever own, your inner self. And once your thoughts are policed, the next step becomes inevitable, targeting the group whose bodies and desires were easiest to label as dangerous. Women as the main target. When sexuality was transformed into sin, it didn't land equally on everyone. The burden fell hardest on women, and that was no accident. In many cultures, men's behavior could be excused, framed as weakness, temptation, or boys being boys. But women were treated as the embodiment of purity or the source of corruption. Entire civilizations began to measure a woman's worth not by her character, her intelligence, or her kindness, but by whether she had kept herself pure. Virginity became currency. Marriage became a transaction built on the idea of controlling women's bodies. And the double standard was woven into doctrine. Men could stumble and recover, but women were told that one mistake defined them forever. This control served a larger purpose. By regulating women's sexuality, religions could regulate family lines, inheritance, and alliances. They could decide who married whom, when children were born, and what families rose in power. Controlling women meant controlling the foundation of society itself. But the cost of this system wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Women were taught to see their own bodies as suspect. Natural feelings of desire were reframed as moral failures. Puberty wasn't a stage of life, it was a warning sign. Curiosity wasn't innocent, it was sinful. And the surveillance didn't only come from priests or leaders. It came from families. Mothers teaching daughters, fathers warning daughters, communities gossiping about daughters. The shame was passed down like an heirloom. Women learned to police themselves, and in turn, enforce the same rules on others. This created generations of internalized fear. A culture where women lived under constant threat. Any misstep, even an imagined one, could destroy their reputation, their marriage prospects, their spiritual worth. Meanwhile, the hypocrisy remained obvious. Men's failures were often overlooked. Leaders themselves broke the very rules they enforced. Yet women's lives could be shattered for what amounted to biology. This imbalance wasn't morality, it was strategy. And the strategy worked for centuries. But when an entire group is made into the main target of sexual control, the shame doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into family structures, parenting, and generational cycles of guilt. Which leads us to the next chapter. How shame doesn't just affect one lifetime, but gets inherited like property, passed from parents to children, reinforced again and again. Shame passed down generations. Shame doesn't just live in one person, it spreads. And when it comes to sexuality, it often passes from parent to child as predictably as family heirlooms. Think about the earliest moments a child begins to notice their body. Natural questions, natural curiosity. In a healthy world, those moments would be met with guidance, reassurance, and honesty. But in a culture steeped in religious guilt, those same questions are met with silence, or worse, with scolding. Don't touch that, don't ask that, don't talk about that. The message is clear. Your body is shameful, your feelings are dangerous, and your curiosity is already a kind of failure. Parents often don't mean harm. They are repeating what was done to them. They are enforcing rules that were drilled into their own minds. And so, the cycle continues. The tragedy is that shame doesn't just teach obedience, it teaches fear. Children grow up afraid of their own thoughts, afraid of being discovered, afraid that something inside them is broken. And by the time they reach adolescence, the fear is so deeply rooted that it feels like part of who they are. This is how control survives without constant effort. Priests don't need to stand watch. Communities don't need soldiers. The beliefs are implanted so early that the people enforce them on themselves and on each other. Even in societies that become more secular, the residue lingers. Adults who long ago stopped believing in religious dogma still carry a sense of guilt about their bodies and desires. Rationally, they may know nothing is wrong. Emotionally, they feel unclean. That's the power of generational shame. It doesn't need scripture in hand to survive. It hides in language, in silence, in the way families talk, or refuse to talk, about sex. And this inheritance of guilt shapes entire cultures. Communities where people cannot speak openly about desire also struggle to speak openly about abuse, exploitation, or coercion. Silence doesn't just suppress pleasure, it protects predators. Which brings us to the next, more disturbing truth. While ordinary people drown in guilt over harmless desires, leaders and institutions often protect the very real abuses that should have been condemned: hypocrisy and abuse. If sexual guilt were truly about morality, you would expect it to be applied fairly. The same rules for everyone, the same consequences for everyone. But history tells a different story. Ordinary people were punished harshly for private, consensual acts. Couples who loved each other outside of sanctioned marriage, individuals caught in desires they couldn't control. These were treated as sins so serious they required confession, penance, or even exile. Meanwhile, powerful leaders, the very people preaching purity, often broke the rules in secret. Priests, pastors, imams, gurus. The titles change, but the pattern repeats. Public sermons against lust, private indulgence in the very acts they condemned. And when the hypocrisy surfaced, it wasn't the system that was questioned, it was the individual who was excused. He fell into temptation. She was weak. The structure stayed untouched, and the cycle continued. Even worse, in many traditions, crimes of real harm, sexual abuse, assault, exploitation, were hidden to protect the institution's image. Victims silenced, records buried, offenders quietly relocated. All while ordinary believers were made to feel damned for something as harmless as desire. This reveals the truth. The goal was never morality, it was obedience. Guilt was a weapon not against immorality, but against dissent. Because if you are always reminded of your own failures, you are too busy seeking forgiveness to question the failures of those above you. And it worked. Entire communities defended institutions that protected predators because they had been taught that criticizing authority was worse than the harm itself. Guilt had blinded them. This double standard exposes the real function of sexual shame. It wasn't to prevent harm, it was to preserve hierarchy. Leaders stayed above reproach, while ordinary people lived under constant suspicion. And that imbalance didn't just poison the present, it planted seeds of lifelong damage in the minds of believers, leaving scars that often outlived faith itself. Which leads us to the next chapter, the hidden cost carried in silence, the psychological damage that lingers long after doctrine fades. The psychological damage. What happens when shame isn't just preached from pulpits, but woven into your very sense of self? The damage doesn't end when you leave religion. It follows you. People raised under strict sexual rules often carry invisible wounds. They struggle to trust their own bodies. A moment of desire sparks anxiety. A healthy attraction feels like failure. Even years later, in loving relationships, they may feel unworthy, as if pleasure itself is dangerous. Psychologists see the pattern clearly. Chronic guilt and shame are linked to anxiety, depression, difficulty with intimacy, even physical dysfunction. The body cannot relax into connection if the mind has been trained to treat every touch as a test of purity. Communication suffers too. When people are taught that even talking about sex is shameful, they never learn how to set boundaries, how to express needs, or how to say no. Silence replaces honesty. Secrets replace trust, and relationships suffer. But perhaps the most insidious wound is self-distrust. When you're told from childhood that your own thoughts are sinful, you learn to see yourself as your own enemy. That suspicion doesn't vanish with belief. It lingers, whispering that something inside you is broken. This is why sexual shame is so devastating. It doesn't just restrict behavior, it reshapes identity. People grow up believing they are damaged goods, that they are permanently stained, that no amount of love or forgiveness can ever make them whole again. And the cruelty is this: none of it was necessary. Desire was never a disease. Pleasure was never a threat. The suffering was manufactured, maintained, and passed on because it served the needs of power. Even when science shows that sexuality is natural, diverse, and healthy, The echoes of shame remain louder than facts. Guilt feels real, even when the reasons for it are long gone. And yet, cracks are showing. More people are recognizing that what they thought was morality was actually conditioning. That what they thought was sin was simply human. But when an institution is built on guilt, what happens when guilt begins to fade? That's where we turn next, the slow unraveling of a system that depended on shame to survive. Breaking free from shame. No one is born ashamed of their body. No one enters the world believing that desire is dangerous. Those ideas are taught. They are repeated until they sink in so deeply that people mistake them for truth. But shame is not the truth. It is a tool, a system built to control. Once you see that, the spell begins to break. Religions have long insisted that sexual guilt was for our own good, to protect us, to keep us pure, to guide us to virtue. But the evidence tells a different story. Suppression doesn't eliminate desire. It twists it into secrecy. It breeds dysfunction, silence, and abuse. What was called morality was often just obedience dressed in holy language. The power of sexual shame has always been its invisibility. You don't need guards when people guard themselves. You don't need prisons when people carry the prison inside their minds. That's why it has been defended so fiercely. Because once it fades, an entire pillar of control collapses. And it is fading. Science tells a different story. Psychology tells a different story. Our own experiences tell a different story. Pleasure is not corruption. Desire is not sin. Intimacy is not weakness. These are not flaws to be confessed. They are part of being human. Breaking free does not mean discarding morality. It means reclaiming it. Morality is about consent, compassion, respect. It is about how we treat others, not about policing harmless thoughts inside our own heads. When you strip away the shame, what remains is not chaos. What remains is freedom. The freedom to live without apology. The freedom to choose values for yourself. The freedom to stop begging for forgiveness for being human. And that freedom is dangerous, not to you, but to the institutions that built themselves on your guilt. Because once people stop believing that their most natural instincts are sins, religion loses one of its most direct lines of control. It must compete on ideas, on compassion, on evidence, where it no longer holds automatic authority. Shame was never morality. It was a cage, and cages only hold power as long as we don't see the bars. The moment you see them, you can step outside. Religion turned sex into shame because shame was useful. It created obedience without armies, guilt without crimes, prisons without walls, and for centuries, people believed it was morality. But now we know better. Shame was never the truth. It was a tool. And the moment you see it for what it is, it loses its power. You don't have to carry it. You don't have to pass it on. You can leave it behind and step into a life where your body, your thoughts, and your desires are yours, not someone else's territory. If you've ever felt that shadow of guilt whispering inside your mind, you are not alone. Millions of people are waking up to the same realization, that what they were taught as sin was simply human. And the more we name it, the weaker it becomes. So, if this resonated with you, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and keep questioning the stories you were given. Because freedom doesn't start with answers. It starts with the courage to ask, who benefits from my shame?